What's up guys, I'm Brad Rodriguez from Fix This Build That. Today I'm going to show you how I turn firewood into floating live edge shelves with invisible mounting hardware. Stay tuned, I'll show you exactly how I did it.
I started the project out with a log from a tree that had been cut down. The log had a big split in it from drying, so I figured that I would try to split the log from the top on the other side. Now clearly I'm a novice at log splitting and I had undersized tools, and I quickly realized this wasn't the right way to do it. Instead, I used the hatchet as a wedge into the split, and this worked much better. But if you have a chainsaw, then this would be way easier. With the log split in two, I needed to rough out the shape of the floating shelves. The split wasn't very straight, so I used a chisel and a hammer to clean up the high spots on the log so that it would sit somewhat flat. I used a marker to establish the top of the shelves on the front face of the log and transferred the mark to the back with a long ruler. Now these lines will establish my initial cut, which I'm going to do over on the bandsaw. I could have freehand cut the log on my bandsaw, but I recently broke a blade when an unstable piece turned during a cut, so I decided to make a quick log sled out of some scrap MDF. Now my bandsaw has two miter slots, so I screwed a runner on one side of the MDF and then ran it through the bandsaw, cutting halfway through the sheet. Then I put a runner on some small spacers in the other slot and used super glue to temporarily join it to the sled. I pulled the sled back off the saw, and then I secured the runner with screws, and in just a couple minutes, I had a safe way to cut the logs. I used a marker to extend the cut line on the sled, and now I just needed to line up the marks on the log with the marks on the sled and secure it. As I positioned the log, I realized that the bark was pretty loose here, so I peeled it off, and I evicted a few residents in the process. To secure the log to the sled, I used wood shims and a hot glue gun. You don't need a super strong bond here, just enough to keep it from rocking. I also positioned the log close enough to the front of the sled so that it wouldn't cut all the way through the sled during the cut, and I could use it again for the next piece. With the log secured to the sled, I took it to the bandsaw and started making my cut. The wood was pretty dense, so I just took my time and let the blade do the work. Now if you don't have a bandsaw, you could also cut this with a 20-inch or larger handsaw from the home center. I've actually done this in the past, so it works. The sled worked perfectly though, and after the cut, I could see the grain inside the log and it looked really awesome. I repeated the process with the other log and made the initial cut, but the bark on this one was still pretty firmly attached. So I used a hatchet and a chisel to peel away the rough outer bark before moving on. Now with 2/4 pieces from the log, I needed to get flat and square faces so that I could make the final cuts. I used my joiner to flatten the face that I had just cut on the bandsaw. And this could also be done with a belt sander or a hand plane, but the joiner really makes quick work of it. After getting one face of the log flat, I turned it 90 degrees and I referenced the flat face against the joiner fence. After running the logs through several passes, the two faces of the log were flat and 90 degrees to each other and ready to go back to the bandsaw. To get down to the final size, I used a combination of my planer and joiner. Now running the boards through the planer at 5+ inches is slightly terrifying with such a short piece here. So if you're using a planer for this, make sure to keep your hands far away from the cutter head because it's really exposed when the planer is up this high. I switched back over to the joiner after getting the faces of the shelf parallel because I was just getting a little too much snipe on the planer. Again, I think it's because of the weight and the short length of the board. But after a lot of removal, I got the shelves down to right around 4 inches, which is what I was looking for. I went back and cleaned up the live edge of the shelves a bit more with a chisel and a hatchet and got rid of anything that was soft or rotted. I used a sander to smooth all the chisel marks out, and I was ready to mount the invisible hardware for the floating shelves. Now the hardware that I used has a mounting plate and a set screw that attaches to a 7/16 inch support rod. I'll have a link below in the description to this hardware and all the other tools and supplies that I used as well. I laid the hardware out on the back of the shelves to match my wall studs, which ended up at 15 1/4 inches. To have a flush fit to the wall, the mounting plates need to be recessed into the shelf. At the same time, I realized that my longest 7/16 inch bit was a little too short to fit the length of the support rod. So I killed two birds with one stone here, and I used a 2-inch Forstner bit to drill a recess for the mounting plates. The 2-inch hole is plenty big for the mounting plate, and it's also big enough that I can fit the chuck of my drill into the recess and drill a 1/2 inch deeper hole for the rod. These shelves are pretty heavy, so I decided to try and lighten them by drilling a series of holes in the back with a spade bit. Now honestly, it didn't feel like it changed it that much, but I'm sure it did remove some weight. And also it made these cool little hiding spots in the back. You could stash containers with government secrets and like $2 bills you got from your grandma. I repeated all the same steps for the second shelf, drilling the holes for the mounting and the relief holes. But here's something to watch out for. The front edge of the second shelf drifts in quite a bit, and it's actually shorter than the length of the support rod. Now luckily I noticed this and I didn't drill the full depth. I marked the rod and I cut it to length with a grinder, and then I put it back in and it fit just right. I sanded the shelves to 220 grit, and then I applied the finish. I used several coats of an oil-based polyurethane on the shelves to give it a nice amber finish that really makes the grain pop. The character on the live edges was just amazing when the finish went on. I came back and on the second coat, I used a brush to get into all the nooks and crannies of the front edge. To mount the shelves, I found the wall studs and I used a level to mark for the mounting brackets. I attached the brackets with 2.5-inch screws into the studs and then threaded the support rods onto the brackets. Now sliding the shelves onto the brackets is easy. You just line up the holes and push it straight onto the support rods. Now the tight fit here and the weight of the shelf will easily hold these in place, but you could also add some adhesive into the holes or use a set screw from above into the rod for extra security. It's so cool to see how beautiful a piece of wood that was destined for the fire can turn into. Now I love the chunky feel of these shelves, but you could easily use half the thickness and get 4 more shelves out of the same size log.
I just went full-time as a content creator, and if you want to support what I do, you can go check me out over on Patreon. There's a link right there. There's some great rewards for being a patron on my site between swag, free plans, and a lot of other stuff, so go check it out. If you have not subscribed already to the channel, I'd love to have you as part of the team. And until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome.